This is a podcast from Occupy Radio on Student Radio in Bergen. Please feel free to leave your feedback and comments on our Facebook page, Occupy Radio Norway.
This is Occupy Radio with Anthony and Mr. Pauling.
Hello world, and you're the only world we've got. So let's make it livable as we can. And what could be more livable than spending some quality time with the boys in Occupy Radio, which of course you are listening to now on Student Radio in Bergen here in Norway. Of course you can listen to this on www.srib.no amongst other places. And as usual, we have with us the peace and loving Anthony Hill.
G'day.
The guru of goodness, Rune Storedvedt.
Hello.
From the Occupy movement, by the way. And later you'll hear from Vegard Bilsbach from the Zeitgeist movement. He'll be blowing his trumpet from overseas, from Italy, I believe, a little later on. But Anthony,
Yes?
as usual, you have brought a quote with you, have you not?
Well, I usually like to have a quote that's relevant to the topic of the day, and I usually like to read it out. But, you know, I've gone a step further today because it's war. It's a bit of a hands-on subject, and I found some world leaders, some quotes from world leaders or things that they've said before wars or anyway.
You got a recording?
Yeah, I've got a recording, yeah, so I put it together. I'd like the listeners to know I actually edited this myself, which is a major feat for myself. But chuck it on.
Okay, let's have a listen.
This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. This country is at war with Germany.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
I must tell the House that the Falkland Islands and their dependencies remain British territory. No aggression and no invasion can alter that simple fact. It is a government's objective to see that the islands are freed from occupation and are returned to British administration at the earliest possible moment.
Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. Kuwait is once more in the hands of Kuwaitis in control of their own destiny.
I said a long time ago one of our objectives is to smoke them out and get them running and bring them to justice. We're smoking them out. They're running. And now we're going to bring them to justice. I stand by those words. Afghanistan is still just the beginning. If anybody harbors a terrorist, they're a terrorist. If they fund a terrorist, they're a terrorist. If they house terrorists, they're terrorists. I mean, I can't make it any more clearly to other nations around the world.
Hey, what's a tourist?
Tourist.
We've got to get rid of tourists. Tourist. I thought tourism was good.
Yeah. And I think it's really funny listening back to Maggie Thatcher there, how pompous the people in the background sound in the House of Lords.
Sipping their cups of tea. Yeah, but that actually, the point of that was to show the leaders justifying, or, you know, their speeches before they take their boys and girls into war and to give it some kind of justification and to get the public behind them. But...
Well, you usually bring in a quote or something like that.
Yeah, but there's another one want you to play as well.
Okay.
Because we're going to play it later on during the show as well. But it's a bit about that tourism thing.
A bit more tourism.
Yeah.
Let's have a listen to see who this could be.
In my line of work, you got to keep repeating things over and over and over again for the truth to sink in, to kind of catapult the propaganda. Terrorists, terror organization, terrorist attacks, terrorism, terrorist network, terrorist attacks, terrorist group, terrorists. Iraq, with Iraq, Iraq, Iraqis, weapons. Weapons of terror, terrible weapons. Weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, weapons of mass destruction. Dangerous weapons, even more dangerous weapons. Biological weapons, chemical agents, chemical. In my line of work, you got to keep repeating things over and over and over again for the truth to sink in, to kind of catapult the propaganda.
Quite amazing there, Mr. Pauly. He actually admitted to doing what he was actually doing.
Admitting to catapulting propaganda is one thing as well. That's bizarre. And did you hear the people in the background? It sounded like a comedy club at first. It was like going, yeah, that was good. But then, of course, as they must do, they must play Party Line.
Yes, toe the party line. Yeah.
And it's about tribes, really, isn't it? It becomes tribal.
And now it's time for Who Would Have Thunk It?
When Anthony gives us some unthunkable headlines. So what do you got for us today, Anthony?
Well, I've got, Mr. Pauly, something which may end up being the most unthunkable headline of the year. And I do believe in December we should all vote on the most unthunkable headline of the year. And I think this is going to be a contender. And the headline is, the EU gets the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes,
that
certainly.
was rather controversial. In fact, if there's a better word than controversial, it doesn't spring to my mind right now.
But it's been one of those things, especially looking at Facebook, that most people have been quite negative, but some people have been, yeah, well, they probably deserve it. But tell us why you feel they don't deserve it, Anthony.
Well, Alfred Nobel, he said that he wanted the prize awarded to a person or group who are actively promoting the cause of peace. Now, I'd just like to mention a few points about the EU. EU policies have more recently led to enormous violence on the streets of Greece and Spain and major class divides. Every major EU country has troops in Afghanistan. Every EU country is expected to be a member of NATO, a military alliance. What else? The EU ratified and supported the invasion of Iraq. 6 of the top 10 weapons exporting nations are major EU countries. Even the Norwegian Peace Council, which is a totally separate body, has called for the resignation of the Norwegian Nobel Committee, saying granting the EU Nobel Peace Prize for 2012 indicates its highly political dimension, awarding it to a project that for the past year has proven to represent the opposite of peace. The EU suffers from an extensive democratic deficit with violations of human rights along increasingly social inequality. What do you say there, Runa?
Yeah, I agree with your criticism, and I think the Nobel Committee sort of missing the point that EU, of course, they need to have peace within the EU because they're members of the same organization. But what happens outside that group, it's very apparent that they are not promoting peace in other parts of the world.
Ironically, Nobel was also an inventor.
Yes.
What did he invent? And it's not the door knocker, as in the Nobel Peace Prize. But what did he invent?
Well, he invented something which is used, or was used in war, dynamite.
Dynamite, indeed. How ironic.
Very. We actually have a clip from another inventor coming along, which is even more explosive, coming up in the show later on, Mr. Pauly.
So, Anthony, tell us what's been on the show recently.
Well, in our second show, we discussed the convergence of crises, 5 real and current crises that are facing us all. We've now covered all of these crises except for one, and the last one, which we are going to cover today, is war, and that's what's on the agenda. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of explosive information coming out today, Mr. Pauly. I started off in the last show by saying that during my lifetime I couldn't remember a period of more than about 4 or 5 years when there was not an economic recession. And that has possibly been the case for the last 50 or maybe 100 years, and that the solution presented by our leaders is always basically the same: more growth. And we seem to just follow blindly without question. And the same seems to go for wars. Can you remember a time during your life that there was not a war going on anywhere?
I doubt it. It really depends on the media coverage, I think.
Yeah, well, until more recently, I'd kind of become numb or indifferent to war, because it's splashed across the headlines. It's always first on the TV and the radio news every day, every week, every month of every year since, well, seemingly forever. And, well, for example, the other day I went on the BBC main news page, and 7 of the headlines referred to some kind of war or attack. In the early 90s, the American TV networks proudly brought the first Gulf War into living rooms around the world, showing planes taking off and dropping their loads, live pictures of missiles hitting targets and soldiers using infrared technology for night attacks, just like a big video game, you know? And have you ever stopped to ask yourself, is it really supposed to be like this?
Yeah, it almost becomes entertainment in a way, in a bizarre way.
It's like war in real time now on our TV. People getting shot, but not on the movies, but actually it's actually happening. You know?
In a kind of perverse way, people kind of watch it almost to see what's happening, almost like it just unfolds like a sitcom or a drama or something like that. And it's true, it is splashed everywhere, and it's almost like we become desensitized or something, and there's a sense of resignation. Oh, there's another one.
Yeah.
You know, better go home and meditate or something.
Exactly, and I think that's what our leaders, in a way, they want. They want us to rather just be indifferent to it and let them take care of it, you know. But I want our listeners to not, rather than become indifferent, to ask questions, especially when our leaders take us into yet another war in a foreign country, causing countless casualties to our own boys and girls, and the local civilians, of course. It always leads to further crises. But anyway, we've talked about war in our second show, In the Convergence of Crises, as I mentioned earlier. We briefly said wars have been, in a historic sense, fought over resources, but there's always some provocation, like they killed our people, or there were some human rights violations before the war actually starts. Runa, how do we know it's actually about the resources?
In any war, you need a public justification to engage your enemy, and without it, your troops won't support you and your allies won't rally to your cause. So this is just a pretext and can be true or not true, but I think most historians will agree that any war holds riches for the winner in the form of resources, manpower or strategic security.
Like at school, beat them up and take their lunch money sort of thing, you know. How long has this kind of behaviour been seen, Mr. Runa?
Well, for this show, I think we need to limit our discussion back to the 16th century with the economic time period called mercantilism, which we mentioned in our previous show. And the economic sentiment at that time was that any country's economy should largely be held within itself and therefore needed to protect itself by imposing high taxes or embargoes on other countries. And this kind of thinking made the European nations race for control over colonies.
Ah, yes, wooden ships and men of iron controlling the world, and swashbuckling days and high adventure. Are we talking here about Sir Francis Drake and Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama?
Yeah, that's right. This period of European nations controlling world trade was extensively helped by the use of gunpowder and sailing fleets. And it led to the submission and control over vast areas of lands outside the European continent, which ultimately leads up to the British Empire, which at its peak controlled almost 1/4 of the planet's land area and 1/5 of its population.
So it's no wonder that English is the predominant language of the world. And it seems like it could have been anyone, you know. It could have been German if they had found enough Lebensraum.
Well, if you look broadly at the time period leading up to the First and the Second World War, you could say that the British Empire was cracking up and that new powers were trying to fill the gap in the wake of its collapse. In the aftermath of World War II, it's apparent that there are only 2 major players left. So it's America and Russia, who in turn are become the pillars of the 2 factions, the Anglo-American faction and the Communist faction.
Everybody born before the 80s can remember the Cold War. We even feared the Ruskies down in Australia, didn't we, Mr. Paulie?
And the Americans, of course, were the commies.
Yeah.
But even in Australia, even, you know, way away, we did fear that.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, just a part of the story here. The historical documents show that Churchill foresaw this situation of the 2 factions, and he wanted actually to extend the war by attacking the Russians and oust them out of Europe. But the Americans, they explicitly refused such a move, and Churchill closed the files on this, which he aptly named Operation Unthinkable.
That sounds like a good category for our segment for our radio show.
Yeah. With a Kiwi accent. Unfuckable.
Unfuckable, yeah. So it makes you wonder what would have happened, actually. I'm glad it didn't, but, with the threat of nuclear Armageddon, I guess it turned out all right in the end with the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, just about anything looks good in comparison with nuclear Armageddon. You see, although they never confronted head-to-head, it doesn't mean it was merely a time of peace and prosperity for the world. For some parts, yes, but for many countries it meant widespread destruction and long-lasting conflicts with devastating effects. And how many actually perished as an indirect consequence of the Cold War is unknown. But it's certainly safe to say that we're counting in the millions if we put all the conflicts from 45 to 91 together.
Yes, the consequences of war, Runa and Mr. Pauly. Actually, Runa and I had the privilege to speak to a young lady who had first-hand experience with the consequences of war, and I reckon we can just chuck that on now. War has many consequences, many of which we see and hear and read about in the news every day, like the destruction of property and the loss of life. But one which we don't see as much on TV or read about, and it's not given as much attention, is the displacement of people as a consequence of war. We have with us in the studio today a girl who has first-hand experience with this kind of thing. Azria Mohammed is from Western Sahara, a disputed territory south of Morocco. Welcome to the studio, Azria.
Thank you for having me here.
Can you talk briefly about what the conflict is all about?
Yeah. Western Sahara is the largest African last colony, and it's very shame to talk about colonialism in the 21st century. Western Sahara used to be Spanish colony, and in 1975 was invaded by Morocco. So the war started between the Sahrawi people and Morocco. And in 1991, the United Nations provoked the ceasefire and promised the Sahrawi people to organize referendum for self-determination. But sadly and unfortunately, the United Nations, in the first time in their history, they failed to deliver promise to make the Sahrawi people decide for themselves. And because of the war, Western Sahara is a country that it's divided in two parts. Half of the population live under Moroccan occupation, where people suffer every day human rights violation. The people, they don't have a right for freedom. They don't have a right of expression. They don't have a right of movement. The Sahrawi people, they don't benefit from the Sahrawi natural resources. More Moroccan people are employed. The Sahrawi people are treated as a second citizen in their own country. Of course, they are prevented of studying any foreign language, so they cannot be able to communicate with international media or international experts. The other half of population is in the refugee camps in the southwest of Algeria, and that's my home. That's where I was born and lived.
You were born in the refugee camp?
Yeah.
And you're now 26 years old?
Yes, and I'm really sad that I never been in my country, and it's kind of fatal for me, and I meet a lot of Norwegians that they have been in the occupied territory of Western Sahara, the people that they are supporting or activists in this issue. So I always ask, like child, how my country look like, and so it's a dream that we go back to our country. So I was born under a tent and in the middle of nowhere in the Algerian desert.
Can you tell us why Morocco and Mauritania are so interested in Western Sahara?
Yeah, for Morocco, Western Sahara is a kind of national issue. So for Moroccan point of view, Western Sahara was and it was always a part of Morocco. But if we go back to the history, according to the international Court of Justice, the International Court of Justice, Moroccan claims to the territory, and so it has been never part of Morocco.
So it sounds like this conflict has been going on for a very long time. And what has really happened to the people, especially those in the refugee camps? What do their futures look like?
Yeah. People in the refugee camps, I can simply say it in one sentence: we don't have any future. We don't have any hope, especially when the world and the international community remain to be silent, especially when people just choose to forget about the Sahrawi people that they are in the refugee camps. So more than 165,000 people are now living in the refugee camps, living in very harsh conditions. Everything we get in the refugee camps, we get it from the humanitarian aid organization. We live basically under a tent. I never had a house myself until I came to Norway, so I was born in a tent. And in the summer, if we just talk to the weather, especially in Norway, you like to talk about the weather. It's in the summer, it can hit 50 to 50 degrees. And imagine yourself, you are just in the tent. There is no air. There is no choice for you. There is no one can help you. And because all of us are the same, and we are just waiting. Imagine you wake up every day to do the same routine.
What about nutrition?
Yeah, actually, there is a high level of malnutrition among the children in the camps because all the food that we get, it doesn't have any valuable nutrition. Mm-hmm. It's just food that actually make you feel full. And also, 70% of the women had anemia. And they just give, as I said before, example of myself that I also, when I was a child, I always had malnutrition. Now, since I'm a grown-up person, I still have anemia with me. Mm-hmm. In the camps, there is no future or opportunity for young people. There is no work. There is nothing you can do. It's basically desert. There is no agriculture. We are totally dependent on what we get from the humanitarian aid. And I would like to point out a very important point that because of the financial crisis in Southern Europe, especially in Spain, all what we are getting is decreasing, and the situation is alarming. So the Sahrawi people, they don't have any hope, and yeah.
So how long have you lived in Norway or Bergen?
In Bergen, it's 1 year now, but I have been in Norway 2 years. I came to Norway through exchange project. Mm-hmm. So I was teaching Arabic for 1 year. And I was supposed to go back, but then I decided that I'm in the right place and it's the right time to raise the voice of my people. Mm-hmm. I am a journalist, so if I go back to the camps, I will not help them because people know about the conflict. Actually, they are living the conflict. Yeah. If I were a doctor, maybe I will go back, but I'm a journalist, so I thought to do something.
Where did you study journalism?
I studied in Algeria. Mm-hmm. Just very good question, because in the camps we only have primary school. So this is another story of our suffering, that we have to leave our family or move out from the camps to study abroad in Algeria or Libya or Cuba. Some people studied, few people study in Spain or Norway. Mm-hmm. So I had to move out since I was a child to study my secondary school, high school, until I graduated from university.
Okay, so in the refugee camps, you only get to primary level of education. Yeah. And if you want to go further, you have to move out of the country.
Yeah. Okay. And you are a child and you have to take care of yourself. So, but that maybe today I'm really grateful that I'm educated and I can use my education to help my people.
Okay, and you've written something about this as well that you'd probably like to share with us and the listeners too. Yeah. What's that called?
Well, this is a very small book, and it's called A Norwegian Hope Journey. And today, this interview, I will include it in my journey, Norwegian Hope Journey, because since I moved here, I'm ready to do anything. Interviews, writing. I have contacted a lot of the newspaper to write about Western Sahara. I think everything helps to make people know about the Western Sahara conflict. So basically, it's very different story from the refugee camps. So just to give a picture about how is the life there in the refugee camps and compared to the Norwegian life. So how can the Norwegian people help the Sahrawi people?
So your aim is to raise as much awareness as possible in Norway and the rest of the world about the plight of the people in Western Sahara.
Yeah, because our problem is no one knows about us.
No.
I mean, I feel sad to say it, but I have to admit it. Like, first time when I come to Norway, I'm from Western Sahara. People just...
Where is that?
Yeah.
I must admit I was the same. I'd heard of Western Sahara, but I didn't really know what was going on there.
Yeah.
Don't know about you, Runa.
I heard a little about it before, but you don't really have a picture of it.
Yeah, and they would just say something. Maybe you hear about it, but then, for example, why it's not in the media or why it's not getting a lot of attention? Because there is no blood, there is no bombing like another Arab country or something.
Yeah.
And of course, it's not a good story for the media people.
No.
But actually, it has the same result of the war.
Yeah.
People are suffering from human rights violation in the occupied territory. People are suffering in the camps. They are dying of just waiting, and they don't have any future.
I think we need to use the social media. Maybe we can start a Facebook group, or maybe you've already done that. I'm not sure. Have you? No?
Yeah, I have my own blog, and there is, of course, a Norwegian support committee that they are doing great job for Western Sahara.
Okay.
But of course, you and him, you can start your own initiative, and allowed me here to ask the audience, should I say?
The listeners,
the listeners, that they also, I hope this interview can give them a sight or small idea about this conflict, and they can start their own
campaign
or something, because that's what we need. We need attention. I like to say we are starving for attention. It really feels sad when you say, present yourself, and then you realize that you are not part from this planet.
No.
Like when I came to Norway, I thought I'm coming to a different planet. Everything was different. I was angry that I was born in those refugee camps. I have very beautiful country, but just because of Morocco occupation, just because of the economical interests of France, of EU and everything, I live this kind of life, and my people are living this kind of life.
Yeah.
So you feel angry when you feel that you are ignored, that you are less than a human.
Where can people read your blog?
My blog is asriataleb.blogspot.com.
Okay. Asria Taleb.
Yeah.
Okay. It's ASRIATALEB.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And of course, you can join the Norwegian Support Committee for Western Sahara Facebook page, or and by the way, also, there is the Bergen Film Festival.
Film festival, yeah.
Yeah, and
Biff.
there will be Biff, and there will be a movie about Western Sahara.
So they can go and see that, and that starts this week. In fact, it already has started.
What's it called?
Son of the Clouds, Hijos de los Nubes.
Okay.
Sounds of the Clouds.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for coming in today, and we wish you well with your journey. Yes,
Thank you very much, and you are doing a great job. And believe me, this interview meant a lot to me, and more, it's meant a lot for the Sahrawi people, because it's really, that's what we need. We just need people know about us and telling the other our story. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And that was an interview with Asria Taleb, who is fighting for recognition of her people in the Western Sahara.
We are talking about war today, and anybody out there who has missed the show live can, of course, download the podcast on Facebook, or they can go to our YouTube channel, which is called
Occupy Radio Norway,
just like the Facebook page. And please leave your comments for us, and if you have anything you'd like us to discuss or talk about, we'd love to hear it. But, Paulie, I was wondering how the world would look today if the US actually had have dropped a nuke on the USSR after World War II, or any of the post-war leaders had pushed the red button.
Yeah, or even just a crazy worker at a factory or something like that. But certainly, yeah. And there is a code, apparently. I read about this. There's a code for all presidents to press the button. They're given the code when they're sworn in. And apparently it's 000000000. It's like 8 zeros, and that's it.
Just so they can remember it.
Yeah.
I wonder if they had less zeros for George W. Bush.
Yeah, just so he could remember it, yeah. So like 00. But he has to keep repeating this just to push the propaganda across.
He does, yeah.
Anyway.
Okay, so you guys want me to carry on here?
Somehow, yes.
Okay. Anyway, we were sort of talking about
what ifs and things.
What ifs, and I think what if scenarios can be entertaining in a perhaps scary kind of way. Yeah. It can be good as well, because actually the Occupy movement is built upon the idea of a good what if. So, but anyway, my point here is that I want to tell you that there is a connection between what ifs and the real world geopolitics. So I'll mention to you two books that delve into the what ifs, and the first one out is The End of History and the Last Man from 1992. And in that book, the author Francis Fukuyama, he considers the recent fall of the Soviet Union and poses the question, what if the world accepts the cultural political dominance of an Anglo-Americanism and all countries submit to Western liberal democracy? And he proceeds in the book to advocate liberal democracy as the finest achievement of human societal history, and hints at the vision of a unified and homogeneous world. And the second book is The Clash of Civilization, published in 1996 and written by Samuel P. Huntington. And it is based on the notions of Fukuyama and expands on his question by asking another, what if the world doesn't willfully submit to Western liberal democracy? So in the book, he states that the days of ideological conflict may be over, but that coming major conflicts will revert to cultural and religious demarcation instead. Hence his choice of using the word civilization.
So you think they made a difference in creating the geostrategic politics of today?
Yeah, very much so. But first let me add that several analysts and historians also believe so. And the first and foremost connection that I talked about is that Francis Fukuyama, he is affiliated with a think tank called the Project for a New American Century. And once Bush Jr. was appointed president in 2000, several members of that very think tank got enlisted in his administration. And this list includes famous names like Cheney and Wolfowitz, among many others. And even the author himself earned a seat as a member of the President's Council on Bioethics.
I remember the film by Michael Moore. What was it? Fahrenheit 9/11?
Yep.
There was some controversy about how Bush actually got elected. I smell a rat, as Michael Moore did.
Yeah. But the thing is, there are so many stories about this and so little time. So anyway, coming back to my thread here, the Project for a New American Century basically advocates strong arm tactics to achieve what Fukuyama put into his book, and that is namely the insistence on spreading Western liberal democracies to all parts of the world.
But we said we weren't going to talk about conspiracies, but I've heard this before, and it's usually about how Bush had some dodgy people with him and so forth and so on.
Yeah, I've heard that too, and it's really easy to speculate like that. But that kind of thinking misses the context of the presidencies that the Bush family is involved in. Bush Sr., he had to get to grips with a whole new strategic picture because he came right after the fall of the Soviet Union. And I'm certain his administration saw that period as a cherry picking of new markets and possibilities in the crumbling states of the Soviet Union. So Junior, on the other hand, he had to figure out a way to not become outcompeted by a bustling China and a strong Russia, while also keeping an eye out for Europe, India, and other emerging markets. So the greater context here is that the Cold War necessitated a foreign policy that was concerned with geostrategic control by any means short of a nuclear missile exchange. And what the New American Century is actually doing is just reigniting that kind of thinking and shaping it to fit a new global constellation of players.
It's like bringing back the Cold War in new clothes. So why would they do that, though, you know?
Well, first off, because America has economically relied heavily on its allies during the Cold War to participate in the global market on American terms. And this was briefly touched upon in last week's episode when we talked about Bretton Woods and the exchange of dollars and goods. So when your old allies, they talk of leaving the dollar for euro or even set up global commodities markets, not using the dollar. That means that the old game is nearing an end. And besides that, you have new economies outcompeting your industry by virtue of low wages and technological catch-up. And these kind of things, it would put the scare in any American administration. And secondly, America built its industry and even political ideologies around the consumption of oil.
The old three-letter word.
Yeah,
it keeps coming back.
Yeah, it does. And this has been evident in many of its major decisions regarding the Middle East. We all know this. And since the Soviet fell, this is also partly evident in Central Asia. But this picture is muddled with the motivation of war on terror, and I think we will discuss that later.
But don't they have weapons of mass destruction there? Anyway, if you want to know any more about this, you just have to walk into any bookshop anyway. There's so much literature about it. And just ask for a book on war and oil, and they've got whole sections of it, shelves and stuff about that.
Yeah. Well, I'm not quite finished.
There's more.
I'm just trying this out. Thirdly, perhaps most obvious, is the sheer size of the American military-industrial complex. So the budget spending of the U.S. Department of Defense accounts for 40% of the world's total spending on defense, or should we say military. In 2010, this amounted to $664 billion, which meant it would rank 19 above Switzerland, Poland, and Belgium if the military was a country of its own.
Yeah, in the debate that happened yesterday with Obama and Romney, they were talking in the trillions with the defense budget. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
As a selling point?
Yeah.
Oh, great. So anyway, coming back to my point here, having such a huge military, it makes a comparative advantage that you can't overlook. And because they have been using strong-arm tactics for years with a certain amount of success, it has left them with a military presence and tactical plans that covers every corner of the world. And what the Cold War taught us is that you don't need to actually declare a war to fight a war, and that military presence is a powerful incentive to curb any regime to obey your orders.
That sounds very critical, Runa, of the American foreign policy. Shouldn't they be allowed to protect themselves and their interests?
Of course, but the ends do not justify the means. Their choice of strategy is a self-defeating one, which is evident in how they are losing the hearts and minds of people all over the world, even in their own country.
What do you mean by self-defeating in this case?
Well, ultimately, they can't win the world by the scale of violence which they have applied. It's widely unpopular, and you can see that by the sheer size of anti-American sentiment in Europe and other parts of the world. And even though they secure access to resources, they're doing so at a tremendous cost to their own people in terms of manpower and money for education, healthcare, and social welfare. America is literally going bankrupt city by city, and the bloated military expenditure plays a major role in this.
The world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Yes, that was the voice of Mr. Oppenheimer, and expressing exactly what he felt after the nuclear test in the desert of New Mexico. I think it was in 1945.
Was it Nevada, maybe? One of those places, yeah.
It was in July 1945, and yes.
What was he expressing then?
Regret and knowing, I'm the, what did he say, on the something of death?
How did he feel after Enola Gay dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, I wonder?
Exactly, yeah. And
that was the atom, sorry, but that was the atomic warhead. But
it's funny you said in the beginning, though, he said 2 people laughed and 2 people cried.
Yeah.
Expressions of human emotion after something like that. But, Mr. Pauly, have you ever seen Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, or maybe Apocalypse Now, or Platoon?
Yeah, I have.
Depicting the absurdities and horrors of war in Vietnam?
Sorry. What strikes me about those films is just how almost insane human beings become in that context, I think. Yeah.
And you know what? And it's funny you say that. I don't want to steal Mr. Vergaard's trumpet blowing, but he's going to be talking a little bit about that later on. But with movies like that, we've come to understand the evil nature of war. But war has changed a lot since Vietnam, and I reckon Runa has something to say about that.
Yeah, sure. Although the horror and evil consequences of war haven't actually changed much since the day of swords and bows, like people get killed and the situation goes really bad. The war makers have come a long way with new technologies and devious tactics. For instance, the Vietnam War was largely a conventional war fought with upgraded weaponry similar to the inventions which we saw during World War II. But it's not until the first Gulf War in 1990 you see the widespread use of precision-guided missiles, anti-ballistic missiles, and heavy reliance on GPS and AWACS coordination. And the media dubbed this first high-tech war as surgical strikes against military targets, which led many to believe that civilian casualties were a thing of the past. And Defense Secretary at the time, he said, "We can't know for sure how many civilians died." But actually, an independent demographer, she calculated the losses at 40,000 military and 13,000 civilians died from direct fire, and 70,000 people died indirectly from the loss of infrastructure.
That's a huge contrast to the number of casualties by the coalition, with about, 500 dead, and the Q-80s with about 1,200 dead. At least that's what it says on Wikipedia anyway. But the thing is, you can't really know for sure who to trust when it comes to war statistics.
No, and any war maker knows you need to control the flow of information, and we can think of this in terms of spies and counter-spies, but the Cold War saw the use of special kinds of tactical warfare, which is very effective. One of the great lessons of the Vietnam War was that it's hard to get public support if your troops are hurting bad, or the public get to know about the atrocities perpetrated by you. So what can you do? You get a neighboring country or a rebel group to start a war and make sure you treat them well with weapons and munitions. And examples of U.S. involvement in this kind of way can be found in the Iran-Iraq War, the Contras War against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, and we should, of course, mention the relationship between the U.S. and Taliban in Afghanistan.
And we do focus a lot on the U.S., of course, but it must not only be them that does this.
No, I'm glad you point that out, because in these conflicts where the U.S. are fighting by proxy, which is called, there's usually also a proxy connection on the other side. So in the Korean War, it was China backing North Korea. In Vietnam, the Soviet Union backed the Viet Cong. But there's also been other examples of regional conflicts without superpower involvement, like the Kashmir conflict in India.
What about the Syrian civil war right now? Can we call that a proxy war?
Well, there are considerable outside interest in replacing Bashar al-Assad's regime. And on the one hand, you have the regime supports from Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas, as well as close ties to Russia, who has their only regional base located in Tartus on the Syrian coast to the Mediterranean north of Lebanon. On the other hand, the rebels have supports in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, as well as logistical support by the US, UK, and France. And both sides have an influx of weapons and manpower, but it's very hard to find information that determines the size of outside influence. But what we do know is that Syria has a sizable army and a landmass that give them an important strategic impact on this region. And especially when you consider their proximity to Iran. And I think the final decision on whether to define it as a proxy war will be up to analysts and historians.
Mm. I've heard rumours that there are some military groups operating in Syria that aren't recognised as either rebels or regime troops. Do you know anything about that? Have you heard anything?
I'm sorry to say I don't know about that to actually talk about it. But it's not inconceivable at all when we consider the number of interests involved in the war. And what we do know is that the strategy for covert operations has been on the slate for the U.S. military for a long time. And there has been and still is an unresolved problem of missing congressional oversight into such activities.
Mm. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about these covert operations. Is that like SEAL Special Forces stuff?
It's not just that. If we take an example, we go back to the 50s when Kenya was still under British rule. There was an uprising by a tribe called Mau Mau, and they unsuccessfully tried to quell this by conventional tactics, and it didn't work out. So they found out that they needed to recruit individuals of the Mau Mau tribe who they could train and to act as Mau Mau insurgents. So these groups, which looked like Mau Mau rebels, they befriended and backstabbed the insurgents and ultimately helped to capture the leader. So they played a major role in ending the hostilities. And a similar strategy has also been suggested for the use in the Middle East, but we simply don't know the extent of this kind of operation. And but former CIA officials have revealed that there were independent covert operations back in 2004, which were located in Algeria, Yemen, Tunisia, and Syria, and that covert operations were being expanded rapidly with the aim of fighting terrorism and preparing for a possible invasion of Iran.
Mr. Pauly, going back to the Vietnam War, do you remember that in America they had the draft?
They had conscription, didn't they?
Yeah, and it was. I think Australia had a kind of conscription as well, not quite as like mandatory as in the US.
But it's almost as random as odds and evens in a way. It was.
Yeah, it was a birthday. If your birthday fell on a certain day, then you had to go in. Mr. Runa, I don't know what your dictionary looks like, but you've come up with a new term I just saw on my paper here. I've never heard before. The term is casus belli, it looks like. A quick Google reveals that it's Latin for justification for acts of war. Warmongering dictators, do they really need any justification for what they do?
Well, it's not just dictators that use this, that have to use this casus belli. Mm-hmm. The curious thing about us humans is that we will submit to the most horrendous conditions and perform vile acts as long as someone gives us a good reason for it. Now, the casus belli doesn't need to be true. It just needs to work well enough to inspire your troops and rally your allies. And in the second invasion of Iraq, you couldn't very well start to explain the intertwined complexity of the economy, geopolitical concerns, oil dependency, and the whole mess of historical tampering in the region. So good old George, he kept it simple by saying Saddam Hussein is an evil man, he's harboring Al-Qaeda, and has weapons of mass destruction. He's a threat to us all.
And this is not to say that Saddam Hussein was an angel either. I mean, he was a criminal.
Yeah.
But it's not justification for war, because there were no weapons of mass destruction proven to be found.
No, it wasn't.
Yeah, so I think it's that the just part of that justification sort of stems from the 9/11 attacks. Would you agree to that?
Well, I don't believe that 9/11 was a just cause for the invasion of two countries and the killing of tens of thousands of people. So if we apply this same kind of cynicism that's being used for collateral damage, in the invaded countries, you could say that the 3,000 casualties is a small number for all the damage already inflicted by American foreign policy. So even when you compare it to the domestic causes of death, it's a small number. Every year, somewhere between 15 to 24,000 are killed by homicides, or somewhere around 30,000 are killed by traffic in the U.S.
It seems like an unfair comparison, though. You know, we have to fight terrorism, don't we?
Yeah, I agree with that. But hurting civilians is a rather counterproductive strategy if you just apply a little common sense. If we look at the term terrorist, it doesn't have strict rules on application except for the fear factor. So the distinction between a terrorist and a freedom fighter seems to be adjustable by which side of a conflict you are inclined to.
So what you're saying is the war on terror is actually a rather nonsensical notion.
Yeah, for us, but from a geostrategic perspective, it makes perfect sense. If you couple it with Huntington's book, which says that conflicts will adhere to religious and cultural demarcation, you certainly have a justification to invade just about any country with a Muslim majority. And that's a very powerful option opener. And even if you don't invade, you can still rally political support, which in turn allows you to pass laws that limit freedom, allow for extensive surveillance and covert operations. Now, the key word here is fear, and we know it's a powerful motivator for the public to allow extended policies.
Yes, they're always trying to get us scared. And I remember Noam Chomsky has written about that and spoken about it in his manufacturing consent concept. And the bugles of war begin to blow, don't they, boys? And speaking of blowing things, our mate Vergaard, who recently moved up north, is no longer here in our studio. He's actually on the line, and it seems he has a lot of wind in his trumpet today.
Hello, Vergaard.
Hello.
There's the man from... Where are you, Vergaard?
I'm in a small village called Naiva, I think, in Italy. It's a small village on a hilltop surrounded by vineyards.
Wow. Have you met
really nice.
Have you met any mafia?
No mafia, but just vineyards. Lots and lots of vineyards.
And probably lots of good wine and olives and things too.
Yeah, I have.
Well,
I've been biking in Barbaresco. Yeah.
Well, you've got us...
It's ridiculous, really.
You have us suitably jealous here in the studio in Bergen here, where it's about 4 degrees and dark.
You should join me here.
That would have been nice.
But Mr. Vergaard, what do you have to say about war today to our listeners?
Yeah, it's kind of hard for me to be angry right now, but I'll give it a go. Now, I want to talk about what I feel is often left out of the equation when we talk about war. Regardless of the justifications, war is ultimately about human beings killing other human beings. But killing other people is not a natural part of human nature, as some would have us believe. According to Dave Grossman, a former West Point psychology professor, trained soldiers in the American Civil War fired over the enemy's heads. And of 27,000 muzzle-loading muskets recovered at Gettysburg, 90% were loaded, and almost half of them with multiple loads, meaning soldiers reloaded without having fired, indicating that they only pretended to be shooting. Similar things were seen in World War II. An investigation based on post-combat interviews indicated that no more than 15 to 20% of the individual riflemen fired their weapons at an exposed enemy soldier. Grossman lists 5 key factors involved in killing another human being, which have all been manipulated throughout history. The first is demands from authority. A good example of how authority can influence behavior is the Milgram experiment. Subjects are told they're taking part in a learning experiment and must administer electric shocks to his co-subject when he gets an answer wrong. The co-subject is an actor screaming like he's being shocked and eventually going silent to simulate that he's passed out or dead. In the original Milgram experiment, 65% of the subjects administered the maximum voltage even after the person receiving the shocks had stopped screaming. In all cases after being told explicitly to keep going. The second key point Grossman mentions is group absolution, which means something like the feeling that you owe the others in your group something. An experiment which illustrates both how demands from authority and group absolution can influence people is the Stanford Prison Experiment. Psychology professor Philip Zimbardo divided volunteer students into a group of guards and a group of prisoners supposed to role-play a prison environment for 2 weeks. The experiment was stopped after 6 days for concern about psychological damage to the participants. Both the guards, the prisoners, and Zimbardo was so caught up in their roles that they didn't notice how their ethical compasses had been switched off. The third key factor is predisposition for killing, which can be attained through training and conditioning. Make killing a reflexive response to stimulus rather than a conscious action. One of the oldest tricks in the book is military training with strong discipline. Nowadays, we've included new methods trying to make war more like a video game by using the same kind of controllers and interface. Grossman's fourth factor is the total distance to a potential victim. It's easier to kill from afar than up close and personal, but he's not just talking about physical distance. He's talking about creating emotional distance by cultural, moral, or social means. This can be done by dehumanizing the enemy. Often this is achieved through racism. Just think about how Jews were considered as Untermenschen, Japanese and North Vietnamese as goofs, and even how Iraqis became sand niggers. If the enemy is not a proper human being, why would you care if you kill him? In the war on terror, the term Muslim terrorist has been used to dehumanize the enemy in the mind of the public. What the news leave out is that the someone called a terrorist might have been a perfectly decent guy until some soldier with a gamepad and a drone precision bombed his kid. Grossman's last factor is the target attractiveness of the victim. In some cases, this boils down to a question of me or him. But there's also a potential gain by killing in the form of tallies, medals, and bragging rights among fellow soldiers. What some also carry home with them is something called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Originally called shell shock during World War I, it's been refuted as an illness by the military services for decades. It's basically people mentally breaking down because they naturally have very strong feelings connected to war memories. And what's the military solution to PTSD? Well, things like the drug propranolol, which the U.S. Army is proposing to use, not to remove traumatic memories, but to reduce the emotional response to them. This kind of numbing helps. In fact, it makes them more like the 2% of people that has never had a problem with killing the enemy, sociopaths. When it's gotten to the point where we're actually producing social deviants to continue waging wars that have absolutely no rational justifications, it's time to blow the trumpet and try to make people take a good long look in the mirror.
Something that Vegard just said brought to mind a video that you and I watched of the WikiLeaks that was released by WikiLeaks there of the soldiers up in the helicopter way away and shooting down those defenceless Reuters journalists and the children in the car and congratulating each other and actually laughing in the helicopter at the time.
They were laughing and they were just like a couple of teenagers on a couch playing a game. Yeah. It was just like that. Like, we got him. Wait, well, look at him. He's trying to get away. You know, so
shoot him down.
Yeah. Which actually kind of reminds me a little bit of the whole idea of Iraqi prisoners being tortured by people, Americans and British people in uniform, videoing it on their iPhones or whatever, sending it back.
As a brag.
As if it's some kind of trophy or something like that. Ridiculous.
Do you have a comment on that, Vegard?
Yeah, regarding the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, the prison with all the soldiers taking pictures with the prisoners they were torturing and really treating badly. The guys, it's been compared to the Stanford prison experiment. Actually, Philip Zimbardo, the psychology professor involved with that experiment, he got involved in the defense team of one of the soldiers from Abu Ghraib in the case against him, and he testified as an expert witness, actually.
Well, Vegard, thank you very much for your trumpet blow today, and we'd actually like to keep you on the line for a bit because we're going to have a discussion, and I'm going to actually start this discussion now by asking how we can actually resist war and violence with words and ideas. Would you like to take that and run, Runa?
Yeah, I can start off by mentioning a prominent American called, his name is Gene Sharp, and he published this book which outlines how you can fight or topple regimes without resorting to violence.
Mm-hmm.
And this was actually used in the Orange Revolution in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been a lot of other examples as well where his ideas have been used. And basically he takes the same kind of principles that Gandhi used, and he postulates these different kind of rules you have to adhere to so that you avoid actually going into violent situations or situations where the violence is highly potential.
Mm. Gandhi brought tens of thousands of soldiers to a standstill just by his fasting, didn't he?
Yeah, he did a lot of good things, and it really illustrates that a lot of the thinking behind using violence is just that people are short-circuiting their creativity.
Mm. So what else can we do? What about the social media? How can we use that?
Well, it worked in the Middle East, or at least in North Africa, didn't it?
Yeah, if you're talking about the Arab Spring, it certainly did work.
Yes, and there's even the thing that's happening in Iran, between Iran and Israel. The people in Iran were sending videos of themselves or pictures of themselves saying, "We don't want war with you," and posting it or having it posted on social media.
And I think the main thing here is actually to question your media sources.
Yeah.
And try to find out what is the real truth. Who are these people on the other end? What are their true intentions? And if you look at the Iranians and you look at the people in Israel, they're basically just the same.
They are. Actually, I must correct that by saying Israeli citizens were doing exactly the same thing as well. I shouldn't just say it was the Iranians, because the citizens don't want war.
No.
And that's why my next point was don't believe everything our leaders tell you. And I'm not saying that they're lying outright. But I think you should just do your own research and just don't believe and follow like a sheep.
Yeah, and actually you need to speak out against racism. And Vegard has a very valid point when he talks about this dehumanization, that all this kind of intermingling of the words terrorist and Muslim, that these two a lot of times get mentioned in the same sentence. It makes for a bias. It makes for racism.
Yeah, and then you throw in words like towel head or sand, whatever it was,
Sand niggers.
Yeah. Vegard, can you still hear me there?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's very important is to kind of broaden your own horizon when it comes to different cultures and different people. Like now there's a lot of suspicion connected to Muslims, but most Muslims are just normal people. There's nothing to be afraid of there, and people need to just broaden their horizon, explore cultures they don't know, and try to bridge the difference between different cultures and create understanding. I think that's very important, as well as questioning authority. That's really, really, really important.
Yeah, you're right. Another point we hadn't discussed actually is what about joining armies? Would you if you found out that someone close to you, a brother or a nephew or someone was going to join the army, would you try and talk them out of it?
I don't know. I guess I would have tried at least, but I've been in the army myself, and it was an interesting experience seeing how you can be manipulated, and the group absolution thing, feeling you're a part of the group and you can't let your group down. And I can imagine that it's hard to talk to someone who's in that situation and is a soldier, and try to make them believe that, to understand that it's the wrong thing. But of course, you have to try. And I love the old anti-war slogan, what if they called the war and nobody came?
Yeah.
And I think that's a profound expression.
Vegard, questioning authority, as you mentioned before, two very difficult words, and perhaps one of the causes of war as well, in a sense that people dare not do it. When you were in the army, did you feel that you could do that at all?
Yeah, I tried. You have in the ordinary military service in Norway, a lot of time you do. It's about obeying authority. So you do these pointless things, and if you question it, they say, yeah, you just have to do it. And I was one of the guys who really questioned when we got a nonsensical task. I questioned, why do we have to do this? And that had an influence on my evaluation score. That I wasn't disciplined enough. And of course you can question authority in an army, but the thing is, if you don't have obedience and discipline in the military, it doesn't work. You have to you rely on that when an officer gives an order. You can't think. You have to just act. And you have to trust that officer. So the problem is the military. It's not how the military operates.
I think I want to just comment on something because we've said that we need to question authority, but I think we need to go even further, and we have to put pressure on authority, and we put pressure on the legislators.
Exactly.
So we can ask our politicians or people in office to not support things like landmines, or have them to refuse to be a part of unjust wars. And we can also ask why can't I refuse to have my tax money used on making bombs and dropping it on people's heads.
Or if they decide there is a conflict escalating now in between Israel and Iran, and I can see whoever gets in the next election is going to escalate it even more.
Maybe.
But we should pressure the Norwegian government and other governments not to be involved in it and not to support it.
Yeah, and not just not support it, but also speak out against it.
Yeah.
Norwegian government has been for a very long time like a dog to the American foreign policy, just wagging its tail and tagging along.
Yeah.
And we need to actually take a stand and show that we are proper human beings.
Yeah.
And we will not stand for this kind of misuse of our armed forces.
Mr. Pauly, would you join the army, or what would it take for you to be involved in an armed conflict?
Well, it might take a lot of pressure from people around me, and that sounds a bit weak, but I guess if you look back towards other wars, people join up because of societal pressure. Why did thousands of Australians go and fight in England, which is 13,000 kilometers away, or for England, so far away,
Europe, yeah.
to defend Europe? They mostly did it because they had to.
But we know so much more about it. Would you join up just to defend yet again another kind of oil or resource-based war? Or because I was thinking about that myself. Somebody asked me that, and I think under the only circumstances I would fight was if I was threatened, or if my family or my town or city or country was physically threatened by another country. I don't know.
It's a good question. It's a difficult question, and that's probably why wars do happen. But I would try everything I can to avoid fighting and to propagate peace.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we still need to remember that there is a lot of things we can do to actually get in a position where you are forced into a war.
Yes.
And we need to be more take more responsibility in understanding what our politicians are thinking, why they're thinking it, and tell our politicians, don't be a pussy.
Yeah. Stand up to them.
Yeah. To what extent, perhaps Vergard, you might know a bit, being from the Zeitgeist movement as well, to what extent is war about human nature? To what extent does human nature dictate that we have to fight others?
The justification for war is very much about human nature. The argument that it's just how we humans are, that war is a natural part of us, and it will always be a natural part of our culture. But when it comes to what's really going on, then you can't really talk about human nature, because all it's a very complex interaction between biology and culture. So they really, I don't like to talk about human nature at all. There's human behavior, and human behavior can be very, very, very different things, depending on what environment you live in. So that really determines it all.
But Mr. Pauly, isn't it time for...
It is time for...
Science and Tech Breakthrough of the Week.
Where Anthony...
There's another fantastic jingle by Mr. Pauly.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Mr. Pauly, did
Yes.
your dad ever tell you about the birds and the bees?
Well, firstly, it was my mum.
Oh, was it?
And then she said, well, Paul, you know, you have a penis.
Mm-hmm.
And when the man... And she did that. But then I started wondering, why is it called the birds and the bees? Because I knew all about it beforehand anyway.
Anyway, yeah, most of us do.
Yeah, and then I wondered, why is it called birds and the bees? Because birds don't really have sex. And I can't imagine a bee, like, humping away.
Yeah, on a bird.
On a...
Yeah, because where did the flowers come in?
I could just imagine myself humping away on a bird.
We won't go there, Mr. Pauly.
This segment should be called Sex Talk of the Week instead.
You're probably wondering where it's leading.
Yeah, I am.
Well, I'm going to tell you about vitamins for bees, because this is the science and tech breakthrough of the week. And around the world, honeybees have been vanishing at an alarming rate. And I don't know if you've read about that in the newspapers and everything, but actually it's been going on for about 10 years now.
Is this why it's called vitamin B?
Another good one from Mr. Pauly there. But we need bees, Mr. Pauly. We need bees. Bees not only provide honey, but they're also vital for pollinating crops. And this is not only distressing, but it puts our agriculture at risk. And you know what our agriculture is, don't you? It's our food.
It is.
Yes. And we're getting rid of all the bees. And the reasons for the decline are still unknown. I've heard rumours about, it's mobile telephones and all that kind of stuff, and it's putting their antennae out of whack. The reasons for this decline are still unknown, but a Florida-based company claims to have found a solution in the form of a concentrated organic feed supplement called Bees Vita. Now, Bees Vita is said not only to protect bee colonies in danger of collapsing, but actually causes them to grow and thrive. Now, colony collapse disorder, as it's known, CCD, costs billions of dollars worldwide because of its impact on honey harvesting and on the role of the domestic bee in pollinating crops and wild plants. And the cause, while remaining unknown, there are many theories about why CCD occurs. Possible causes are include things like mites and parasites and viruses and fungi and immune deficiency and climate change and malnutrition and pesticides and all kinds of things that we've discussed in this show. And I even think the culprit could be, as I said, mobile phones and genetically modified crops, which we have talked about as well. Anyway, no matter how it was caused, they've developed this Bees Vita, which is helping the bees, and by golly, we need the bees, Mr. Pauly. I'm a little sceptical, however glad that this issue has finally been dealt with, and I hope it just gets better.
And as Hamlet said, to be or not to be.
Oh, you had to come out with that one, didn't you? Jesus. Sinking to new lows. But, Mr. Pauly, that's the end of the show. We don't have any time for any more.
Damn it.
Yeah.
I felt like we've just begun. But thank you very much, Anthony, for a lovely show. I've enjoyed myself immensely.
And thank you, Mr. Pauly, and Runa for his impeccable research there.
Oh, thank you, guys.
And thanks to Vergard Bietzbach from the Zeitgeist Movement, of course.
And also the inimitable Adrian, who, without him, this show would not go quite as smoothly, would it, Mr. Pauly?
No, and we could use prepositions like without whom, for example. Wonderful.
Oh, geez, I'm having a nightmare today.
But you are on Student Radio in Bergen, and this has been Occupy Radio. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope you can listen to our next show next week, or our podcast, of course.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.